Good morning, everybody. Good evening. Thank you for joining me today for a talk on Tokyo. As you can see from the screen here, I've been in Tokyo for 20 years. I came here originally to study Japanese for 1 year. It ended up becoming 2, and then 3, and now, before I knew it, 20 years. I was a researcher at Meiji University working on a project specializing on Asakusa culture, particularly Sarawakucho, the Kabuki district, and also on the firefighting brigades of Edo. I've been with Walk Japan since 2012, and I specialize in the Tokyo tour. I'm wanting to share my passion for the city, but I also lead the Okinawa tour, the Yaema voyage, which is a little bit different than the usual Walk Japan walking tours, in that focuses more on adventure and water sports and getting out into nature. If you have a chance, definitely come down and do it. It's a lot of fun, and it gives you a chance to see a different side of Japan. I have become very quickly knowledgeable about Japanese youth baseball and fast-pitch softball, as my son is involved with both. It has been quite a learning curve, and although baseball has been in Japan almost as long as it has in the States, it is a little bit of a different animal. And also I am now scorekeeping as well, which is quite interesting. So without any further ado, what I'd like to do is give you a brief glimpse into Tokyo's past and how we can access it a little more easily and make the city more accessible and interesting. So one of the most common refrains I hear from people on tours and then online as well is that Tokyo is so overwhelming, and that there's no way, that people often say after the Nakasenda Way when they're on their own, there's no way I can navigate Tokyo. Well, one of the things that Tokyo has going against it is that there is no there in Tokyo, a defining image that pops up in people's minds when they think of the city. It is simply a vast, featureless urban jumble. In contrast to this, Europe has many places that reveal their history and character through architecture. If I was to say Big Ben, Westminster Abbey, what comes to mind? London. How about the Arc de Triomphe or Notre Dame, Montmartre, Paris? The Colosseum, Trevi Fountain, the Pantheon, Rome. In contrast to that, all most people see in their minds when they think of Tokyo is lost in translation. While Tokyo can seem overwhelming in the scale of its activity and the multitude of its areas and neighborhoods, it is possible to get a handle on the city. Once you know a few basics about its past, how it was developed, and where to find Tokyo's history, which is really much more accessible than you might think, the city's order will become clear, and its character will be easily spotted, and Tokyo will click. It will make sense. It'll become a much more interesting and enjoyable city, and that's what I want to share with you. So what I want to do today is put Tokyo into context for you, let you see how Edo developed and how that Edo impacted and affected the growth of the city and continues to do so to this day. And we can do this through a few simple tools, like ukiyo woodblock, with also using ukiyo woodblock prints. So the growth and development of the city. Why did Tokugawa Ieyasu choose Edo? Well, there are a number of theories on this, but one of the most easily accessible answer is that it was because of defense and control and the possibility for growth in the future. Odawara Castle offered a better castle, and Kamakura offered better defenses. However, Odawara Castle was further from water, making it harder to supply. And Kamakura, the mountains that hemmed it in, were good for defense, but would limit any potential growth. When Tokugawa Ieyasu entered Edo in 1590, it was a swampy backwater fishing village with barely more than 100 households in it. It was sitting on the edge of a tidal estuary. Edo had no good drinking water and very little ground that was not flooded out by seasonal rains. However, it did have one feature that drew Ieyasu's attention, the castle. The castle itself was built in 1457 and sat on the edge of a tableland surrounded on 3 sides by water. If we look at the slide here, on the north, there were two rivers, or there was a river on the north and a river on the south. And then at the back of the castle was the Hibiya Inlet and Tokyo Bay. Now, when Tokugawa Ieyasu arrived here, the castle had not been used for almost 80 years, so it was in dilapidated condition. However, its superior defensive position made it an ideal choice for the seat of Ieyasu's power. Here, he would only be vulnerable from one direction, from the west, and he could control traffic both into and out of the economically important backlands of the Chiba Peninsula, and also be far enough from the prying eyes of Kyoto so that he can consolidate his power easily. And unlike Kamakura and Odawara, Edo offered more potential for growth, both on land and through its future harbor and ports. So the first thing to remember is that the city was built up to support the castle. Everything revolved around the castle. While the castle grounds have now become the imperial palace, what was true 400 years ago is still true today. Everything revolves around the castle. Now, the castle is no longer the center of the city's raison d'etre, but physically, the imperial palace is still the center of Tokyo and all traffic. Cars, buses, subways, and trains all flow around its periphery. As such, there is no true direct north or south, east or west line, subway lines, train lines, or roads that cross the city. All must skirt around the palace. Even the subway lines do not cross under palace grounds. Major railways are laid out in belts bending around the imperial palace with it as its center. So keep this in mind as we take a look at the following maps. I'm going to go a little bit more into the map that we're looking at right now. When Ieyasu arrived in Edo in 1590, he wasted no time in setting plans in motion to bring clean water into the city and providing areas for his vassals and retainers to live. In order to bring in materials and supplies to build up the castle, he built the Dosambori, a canal that ran from the bay into the shores of the castle. Hibiya Inlet was quite shallow, so there was no way that ships could get up to the castle, and this is why the canal was necessary. At the same time, he started building the construction on the first waterway, the Koishikawa waterway, which was going to bring water into the city for the city's residents. Being so close to the ocean, the water table here is very, very saline. Didn't have good drinking water, so this was essential. And if we look at the map right here, what would become the Kondo waterway was this line right here. And this was started in 1592. The waterway was completed eventually in 1629, and it was 26 kilometers in length, and it brought water in from natural springs from Inokashira Pond, a spring in Zenpuku Temple, and Myosoji Temple far to the west of Tokyo. These waterways provided drinking water for the city up until 1901. In 1596, Ieyasu ordered the leveling of Kanda Mountain, and the fill from this was used to fill in marshy lands here and also fill in Hibiya Inlet to provide residences for the daimyo and the commoners in that area. We'll move on to our next map here. And before I get too ahead of myself, one of the things I'm going to talk about is, one, we're going to see a lot of maps. I enjoy maps. Hopefully this will allow you to see some of Tokyo's history, but I don't want to let my passion for maps override the content that I'm going to give you. Another thing I want to share is the map we're looking at right now is from 1608, and it is oriented with west to the top. In the Edo period, maps had west as the top simply because Kyoto was in the west and the emperor lived in Kyoto, so this was a sign of respect. So many of the Japanese maps we will see are naturally oriented this way. The Western maps that we will be seeing here have been rotated 90 degrees so that north is to the right and west is to the top. So the writing, it may look a little bit odd, but it will allow us to keep the perspective a little bit more in hand and make the information a little more accessible. So the map we're looking at right now is from 1608. I have seen sources say this is from 1602, and I suspect it might be a little bit earlier than the 1608, given simply because the Hibiya Inlet was filled in by the time of 1608. And what we see here is the Hibiya Inlet still remaining. So I suspect this map is a little bit earlier than that. The population of Edo had grown at this point to about 150,000 people. We get this figure from the Spanish governor of the Philippines, Rodrigo de Vivero, when he visited Edo in 1609. The map we're looking at right now only shows the inner moat, the area inside the inner moat, because the outer moat had not been built at this time. In the center, we have the main keep, we have the west keep, we have the north keep, and then we have the area here, which is Daimyo Alley, the area where the feudal lords had their estates. The area here, that was for the senior counselors, the second keep, and then going in more to a part of the commoner district. I want you to keep in mind, one of the things I want to show you is keep in mind this shape here and the shape here, because we are now going to go to (1632). You can see here, here's the North Keep, the moat reflecting, or the moat dividing the North Keep and the main keep isn't reflected in this map, but you can see the shape of these two areas right here and the second keep. The population of Edo at this time in 1632 is about 300,000. By 1644, it had swelled to 400,000 people. It was the largest city in the world at this time. This is a result of the alternate attendance system, which was made official policy in 1635. As a result of this, the feudal lords, the daimyo, had to come into Edo every other year for an entire year, and they had to leave their wives and children and the retainers to support them in the city all year round. And this really fostered the growth of the city. The point at 1644, Edo had grown to an area of 44 square kilometers. Of this, 77%, 34 square kilometers, was given over to the samurai. These were the bukechi, the samurai districts. The remaining 20% was roughly divided between the commoner districts, about 4.3 square kilometers, 10%, and the jinjachi, the temple districts, 4.5 square kilometers. Over time, these divisions would change a bit, but as a general rule, you can think of Edo being divided. Roughly 70% of the area in Edo was given over to the samurai. The remaining 15%, or 30%, 15% for the commoners, and 15% for the temples and shrines. And looking at the map here, there are a couple interesting features that I'd like to point out. When you look at maps and see maps of Edo, areas in white are samurai districts. Areas in gray are commoner districts. And then areas in red, which we don't see here, are temple districts. We've now moved to 1752. In 1720, when they did the first census in Edo, the population of Edo had grown to be over 1 million people and had grown to an area of 69 square kilometers. In 1752, the population had swelled even further to 1.3 million people. A couple of interesting things I'd like to point out here for you. We can see the Kondo waterway coming in to the city and passing through the Mito domains estate, and then Tame-ike, which we'll talk about a little bit later on. This is a reservoir, and we can see now that the outer moat has been completed. An interesting feature that we see here is also the castle has been rendered very much in the style of European castle palace grounds with sculptured gardens, which did not exist at all. Another interesting feature, this is Shinobazu Pond, which was the major pond in Kaneji, one of the two major Tokugawa funerary temples, which later became Ueno Park. This is a map from 1896. After the restoration, the population of Edo dropped to less than 500,000. By 1879, it had rebounded to 670,000. And by 1896, the population was once again back to 1.3 million people. What was the Mito Han's estate has now become the Koishikawa Arsenal. And this we'll talk about again later on when we talk about the garden itself. And I'd also like to point out the Daiba. When Commodore Admiral Perry came to Japan in 1853, obviously he set up quite a store, and the government started allocating a lot of money to the building forts, island forts in the bay to protect the city from invasion. These forts were eventually abandoned, but we can still see them reflected here on the map. And again, everything is going around the castle. We can see the pond from Shinobazu Pond, which is now Ueno Park, and the outer moat is still here. The next map is from 1918. The population Tokyo has grown to 2.3 million people. A couple of interesting things about this map. One, there are 15 wards, special cities. Central Tokyo is composed of 23 wards, or as the Japanese call them, special cities. And these are all individually administered areas. They are complete units in themselves. They are, in some senses, cities, but they do make up what is considered Central Tokyo. Also, here at Shinobazu Pond and Ueno Park, we have Ueno Station and Tokyo Station. Currently, the Yamanote line is a teardrop-shaped loop line that belts Central Tokyo. However, that wasn't the case until 1914. At this point of this map, when this map was made, actually it's 1925, the Tokyo and Ueno were not joined by the Yamanote line. One interesting fact I'd like to show to you something here is, if we look at the map down here, you can see the price is 20 sen. Back then, Japanese currency had two denominations, yen and sen. Currently, we only use yen. We have now come to post-war Tokyo. This is a map from 1948. Prior to the war in 1940, the population of Edo was 7.35 million people. During the war in 1945, it had dropped to 3.49 million. People had gone out of the city for safety. However, after the war, they started flooding back into the city. And by 1950, it was up to 6.28 million people. Again, one of the largest cities in the world. This map was created by GHQ for people in the city. And most streets in Tokyo do not have names. Major thoroughfares do, but most of the smaller streets do not, which is quite confusing for the foreigners, the Americans in the city. So what GHQ did was give the streets names. Avenues were those streets radiating out from the palace, and they were given letters of the alphabet: Avenue A, Avenue B, Avenue C. Other streets that circled the palace were called streets, and they were given numbers, as we can see here: 15th Street, 4th Street. These were used for a while, but were very, very quickly forgotten. And I would wager at this point, there are very, very few people in the city, Japanese, who are even aware of the fact that streets were given names. And our final map, before we leap into some more of the history, is a map of modern day Tokyo. And again, the landmarks are still here. We still see Shinobazu Pond and Ueno Park, the Imperial Palace at the center of the city, Tokyo Tower, Meiji Shrine. The current population as of 2016 in the central area of Tokyo was 9.3 million people. The metropolitan area of Tokyo, I believe, is about 35 million. And the population of Japan as a whole is 127 million people. So Tokyo encompasses about 1/4 of the population of Japan. We're going to jump back in time, reorient our maps up. So north is at the top of the map, and talk more about the development of the city itself. This map is from the mid-1630s. And once again, you can see the primary areas here are white. They are samurai districts. The city itself was divided geographically. There was a ridge line separating the high ground on the west side of the city, which included the Imperial Palace. And this sits on top of a low plateau. This was the Yamanote, the high city. The areas to the east of the palace, going all the way over to the Sumida River, were the low marshy areas that were reclaimed. And this is the Shitamachi, the low city. These were the commoner districts. The ridge line here will become, and again, this is a very, very rough demarcation of the ridge line, but it should serve its function for our discussion today. This ridge line would become very, very important in two future events in Tokyo's history. One, the 1923 earthquake, the Great Kanto earthquake, and then in the March 9th, March 10th fire bombings of the city. This ridge line was important because fires that were sparked by both of these catastrophes raged eastwards and were pretty much halted when they hitched the ridge line and couldn't spread further west. So we have a geographic division of the city. but the city was also divided socially and culturally that mirrors this geographic division. The districts on the west side of the city here on the high ground were the samurai districts. Roughly as I mentioned, roughly 70% of the city's areas were given over to the samurai districts. And we see these reflected right here. When Tokugawa Ieyasu came into the city in 1590, he entered via the Koshu Road with his troops and went straight up to the castle walls. This was the only overland approach to the city. So what Tokugawa Ieyasu did to protect his castle was he gave the land to the west of the castle to his retainers, to his hatamoto, the bannermen, and the gokeni, the household retainers. The bannermen, some 6,000 samurai, were the officers of his army, and these were known as the bankata. And so the area that we have here is called Bansho, and even today there are areas called Bansho, Ichome, Bansho, and Nichame. And this is a shortening from Bankata to Bansho. Bansho was the first of the samurai districts formed and is the oldest, and of the 70% of the area given over to the samurai districts, fully 30% were devoted to Bansho. And until the outer moat was completed in 1636, this was a vital layer of defense for the castle. Now, after the moat was built, they weren't quite as necessary, but the shogunate did not stint on making sure that they were secure, and they were stationed there all throughout the Edo period, all the way up until the Meiji Restoration. Now, on the lowlands of the city, we have the commoner districts, and that's reflected as we see right here. So I mentioned in 1720, the population of Edo was 1 million people. Half of that population was samurai, and half of that population were the commoners. So we have 500,000 people living in only 15% of the commoner districts, and we're seeing that right here. Now, we have the Sumida River right here, and of course, on hot summer days, nothing like a cool river breeze, and therefore this area right here was given over to samurai districts. The commoners were not allowed to have any of the good real estate, of course. There were no public parks, there were no green spaces, so temples fulfilled one of those functions. And here we see the major temple districts reflected in the map. We have Kaneji, we have Sensoji, and then we have Zojoji. These were the two funerary temples for the Tokugawas. 6 shogun are buried here, and 6 shogun are buried here. They're quite large. There are numerous temples, aside from the major temples that I've mentioned, in these areas as well. You'll notice that the temple districts are primarily in the northeast. If you are familiar with Chinese geomancy, feng shui, the northeast is an inauspicious direction. Demons, catastrophes, ill omens tend to come from the northeast. So you put temples in the northeast to act as a spiritual shield for your city. You'll also notice that there are almost no temples or shrines in the center of the city. This is a result of the 1657 Great Meidaki Fire, in which 100,000 people died and a large portion of the city was burnt down. Temples were relocated from the center of the city to the outskirts as a fire prevention measure, because fires happen from candles, and candles and lamps are used quite a bit at temples. So by moving them from the center of the city, the hope was to lessen the chance of fire. And if we have 1 or 2 temples in the northeast, more might be better to act as an even stronger spiritual shield. So many of the temples were relocated to the northeast part of the city. Even today, if you come up into this area here, you will get a chance to visit many lovely, lovely small shrines. So we now have a division how the city is laid out. Over the next 150 years, Edo would continue to grow under this system. It stayed as it was. The proportions would change a little bit, but by and large, this was how the city stayed. The social stratification was very, very rigid. You were born a commoner, you were born a samurai, and that's it. You could be a merchant, but they were the lowest on the totem poles. And as the Edo period continued to go on, the very, very socially elite samurai became more and more indebted because they were paid in rice, and the value of rice went down per unit as Japan became more and more agriculturally proficient. On the other hand, merchants who were very, very, very low on the social totem pole became very, very wealthy. So they had quite a bit of tension between the two there. And then in the 1830s, a series of famines, tsunamis, and earthquakes, and finally the arrival of Perry's fleet in 1853 started to spell the demise of the Tokugawa shogunate. Several very powerful and traditionally anti-Tokugawa daimyo, feudal lords from the west, pushed for the restoration of the emperor, and in a series of battles ranging from Kyoto to Kanneji Temple in Edo, they succeeded in their goal. On January 3rd, 1868, the Meiji emperor was restored to power. There would continue to be battles against the loyalists until 1869, but at that point they were put down and the Meiji restoration was complete. Now, in terms of historical transitions of power, it was quite bloodless. It was very, very smooth. However, for the newly christened Tokyo, it was a time of crisis. Half of the population, the samurai and the Tokugawa shogunate retainers, all left the city. Half the population of the city disappeared. The west side of the city became empty. And for the remaining population, the remaining half in the city, the commoners, this was a crisis. Their customer base was gone. They had nobody to sell to, and therefore they had no money. And this became such a crisis that in 1868, the Meiji government distributed distributed rice to 430,000 people in the city. Each man got 5 kilograms. Each woman and child got 3.5 kilograms of rice. The empty west side of the city was given over to tea and mulberry plantations, and the commoners, or the regular people now, were charged with cultivating these plantations. However, the land wasn't suited for cultivation of tea or mulberry plants, and it was put in charge of by amateurs who didn't know how to raise them. And as such, 70 to 80% of these fields were abandoned due to lack of success. However, as the Meiji period and the Meiji government took hold and became stronger, people started to flow back into the city, and by 1883, the population once again topped 1 million. Now, this has an impact on Tokyo as we know it today. How? Well, the west side of the city had been abandoned. These were the large samurai estates. These were big open areas. So when the city began its rapid westernization, the city that most of us think of as lost in translation, the glittering city, the tall buildings, the masses of people, the lights and neon are all on the west side of the city. However, the commoners were always in the east side of the city, and so with their houses and small streets, they couldn't do any large-scale development. And so the city of the commoner, as I feel, the city where Tokyo reveals its real face, is on the east side of the city. Now, if you come to visit Tokyo, there is something that you'll be using all the time, something that will help you see and feel Tokyo's history. And for those of us living in Tokyo, we use it almost every day. We may not carry it, but we see it and we know it. And that is this, a subway map. A subway map. We are looking at Tokyo's history. Tokyo's history is revealed in its place names. So we have a map here of central Tokyo. This is central Tokyo right here. And although it's in Japanese, I will give you some English translations. And while this is filling in, there's a couple things I'd like to point out. One, hashi or bashi means bridge. So if you see Nihon bashi, Kyo bashi, Asakusa bashi, that is where a bridge is or where a bridge was. There were over 700 bridges in the city. Edo was a city of waterways. Another one is mon. Mon means gate. Hanzo mon, Sakurada mon, Torano mon, Onari mon. These were, by and large, the gates of the castle. So if you see mon, you know that you're probably in an area where there was a gate of the castle. So let's start talking about place names here. First, at the lower left of the screen, we have Tamaike Sanno. In the area around this station, spring water flowed from the surrounding heights and naturally accumulated in a depression here. And so it became called a Tamaike, a reservoir. In 1606, the Asano clan from Wakayama domain built a dam here and collected water, and it became a real pond. This long, narrow pond, it was about 1.4 kilometers long and between 45 and 140 meters wide, was turned into a storage reservoir to provide drinking water for the population and also function as the completing lower part of the outer moat system. Filling in of the Tamike Sano was started in 1875, and by 1889, it had been completely filled in and disappeared. The next place is Akasaka Mitsuke. Mitsuke are gates on castle walls, and in the case of Edo Castle, they are gates on the outer walls, on the outer moat. All of the gates along the outer moat have long since disappeared, but in this area, if you go there now, you can still see the foundations of one of the gate of this Mitsuke. The origin of the name Akasaka comes from the tableland on which the estate of the Tokugawas of the Ki domain were located, and here's where akane, madder flowers, were often collected. As such, it was called Akane Yama or Akane Saka. However, this sort of sticks on the tongue, and it became shortened down to become Akasaka. Our next location is Suidobashi. Once again, bashi means bridge. So Suidobashi is a bridge that crosses the Kanda River, and slightly downstream from this, there was an aqueduct. Suido means aqueduct, from water from which the Kanda waterway would bring water into the city. This aqueduct supplied water to several thousand wooden pipes that flowed underground to wells through all the commoner districts and supplied the city with clean drinking water. By 1629, all of the entire east side of the city had wells in which they could get clean drinking water 24 hours a day, something that not many European cities could say at all at that time. Moving a little bit eastward, we come to Okachimachi. Okachi were low-level samurai who were in charge of security and functioned as the shogun's bodyguard when he was out in the city. There were 20 companies of these okachi, and each company consisted of 2 leaders and 28 okachi. And unlike the hatamoto, the bannermen who had individual estates on the west side of the city, the okachi were given estates per company. Each company had its own estate. They were all concentrated in this area, and hence the name came to be called Okachimachi, or Okachi Town. Kura mai, kura, warehouse, mai, in front. And the name stems from the fact that the shogunate's storehouses where its yearly rice tithes were lined up here. In the Edo period, there were 67 of these storehouses, and they were called the Asakusa granaries. Samurai were paid annually in rice, and they had to use the service of rice brokers, fudosashi, to exchange this rice for cash. The shops of these rice brokers were arrayed in front of the shogunate's warehouses, and so the area came to be called Kuramai. The next area is Bakurocho. Before we explain a bit about Bakurocho, I want to talk about Kodenmacho. There was a denma system. A denma was a system that used horses to send goods, both government official and civil private goods, from post town to get them to Kyoto. You can think of this as a Japanese system of the Pony Express. The shogunate required that each post town have a certain number of horses on hand that could be used at all times, and this was called the denma-yaku. And in the Edo period, in Edo, there were a number of areas that had denma in their name. For example, Kodenmacho, Odenmacho, Minami Denmacho, Yotsuya Denmacho, Akasaka Shin Denmacho. However, they're all gone. The only 2 that remain right now are Odenmacho and Kodenmacho. Now, we're going to jump back to Bakurocho. Now, if you're going to have a Pony Express system, you're going to need horses. And where can you get those horses? You can get them by traders who specialize in horse and cattle, and they were called Bakuro. And they were all located in this area, hence the name Bakurocho, Bakuro Town. Finally, we'll talk about Ningyocho. Kabuki had a very complicated role in the social and cultural landscape of Edo. It was the most popular form of entertainment for the commoners, but for the shogunate, it was a thorn in its side. It represented a lot of problems in terms of the morals of the city and the effect that Kabuki had on those morals. One of the ways that you limit the effects of this, bad effects of Kabuki on the city, was to limit the number of theaters through the use of licenses. Originally, there were 4 kabuki theaters, licensed kabuki theaters in Edo. However, after a scandal in 1714, one of those theaters was eliminated, and thenceforth until the end of the Meiji period, or end of the Edo period, there were only 3 licensed theaters. 2 of those theaters were located in adjoining towns, Sakaicho and Fukiacho, and so these 2 towns became known collectively as Nichomachi. Along with the kabuki theaters here, there were a number of puppet theaters, and a great number of the craftsmen who worked in the puppet theaters were located here and lived here as well, so the area came to be known as Ningyocho, Doll Town. There is another document that will allow you to find Tokyo's history very, very easily, and this is where we can see Tokyo's history writ large, and that's a map. A simple map. By looking at a map of Tokyo, we can see Tokyo's history. I'm going to go into the details a little bit more, but there are a couple of things. There's one thing I'd like you to remember here is, if you see an expressway in the city, a highway near the center of the city, that is where a waterway is or where a waterway was. Tokyo's public area, green spaces, and government offices were all formerly estates of daimyo. I'm going to take a little aside here and get into some technical jargon. I should mention it now before I forget and confuse you. Daimyo had 3 types of estates. They had the upper estate, the middle estate, and the lower estate. The upper estates were the official residences for the daimyo. They were as close to the palace or to the castle as possible, and this is where his wife and heir would live, and where he would stay by and large when he was in the city on his extended 1-year tour. The middle estates were arrayed a little bit further out from the center of the city, and these were a bit larger, they're a bit more relaxed, and this is where the retired daimyo, the current daimyo's father, would live after retirement, or it could be used as a summer villa for the current daimyo. On the outskirts of Edo, we had the lower estates. These were generally much larger, and these are where the retainers were housed. They had storehouses, they kept the goods for each of the domains, properties, and also they were large enough that rice and plants, vegetables could be grown to feed the daimyo and the retainers. And in time of emergencies, these were used as places of refuge. So the 2 areas that we're going to look at now are Shinjuku Park, which was formerly the estate of the Naito family from the Takato domain, which is in present-day Nagano Prefecture. At the time that the Tokugawas bestowed this area to the Naitos, it covered 704,000 square meters, about 174 acres. But when at the end of the Edo period, when it was returned to the shogunate in the Bakumatsu period, it had been cut down to only 218,000 square meters, about 53 acres. And it opened as a public park, and that's the size of it now, after the war. The next area is this right here, which is Camp Ichigaya for the Japanese Ground Self-Defense Forces. And in the Edo period, this was the upper estate of the Tokugawa Owari domain. The Owari domain was in the western part of Aichi Prefecture. Since this area occupied an important location overlooking the castle, after the restoration, it was turned into a military base, and then it became the Japanese Imperial Army Academy in 1874, and that carried over and is currently the location of Camp Ichigaya. Now, not only green spaces, areas, and government offices, daimyo estates, hospitals, universities, and even baseball stadiums were Edo period daimyo estates. We're looking at a central part of Tokyo, and we're going to talk about these 2 areas right now. You've got Koishikawa Korakuen Gardens and Tokyo University. Here we have Koishikawa Korakuen Gardens. In the Edo period, this was the lower, which later became the upper estate of the Tokugawa Mito domain. Since part of the estate grounds had become the army arsenal after the restoration, there were plans to turn the remaining part, the garden that is, into barracks. However, at that point in time, the gardens had become very, very well known internationally and was made a place of scenic beauty after the emperor had visited there. As a result, it was decided to preserve them. Of the original 330,000 square meters that made up the estate, only 20%, which is most of the garden, was preserved. Next, we have Tokyo University and the University of Tokyo Hospital. Similarly to the Mito Domains estate, these grounds were originally the estate, the lower estate, later the upper estate of the Maeda family from the Kaga domain. Kaga is in Ishikawa Prefecture. It was turned into the upper estate in 1683. After the Tokugawas, the Maedas were the wealthiest of the daimyo, and they had an income of 1 million koku. A koku is the amount of rice needed to feed a man for a year. It's about 180 liters of rice, 150 kilograms, equivalent of 6 bushels. And Tokugawas at the height of their power had an income of about 4 million koku of rice a year. Additionally, hotels. Lots of the major hotels in the city were built on daimyo estates. Here we have the estate of the E family from the Hikone domain, the estate right here. Hikone domain is in Shiga Prefecture, which is quite close to Kyoto. After the restoration in 1872, the Fushimi-no-ya branch of the imperial family moved from Kyoto and made this their estate. However, after they gave up their claim to the imperial line and were no longer considered part of the imperial family, they left the estate, and it was purchased by Otani Yonetaro and made into his personal estate. However, following a request from the Tokyo government in 1964, the hotel New Otani was built on these grounds to accommodate foreigners coming in for the Tokyo Olympics. Next to this was the old Akasaka Prince Hotel, which was the estate of the Tokugawa Ki domain. This was quite a famous building, and people in Tokyo could recognize it by its zigzag shape. It was closed in 2011, and currently Tokyo Terrace Garden is located on this ground here. We are now moving south and west, and we're now in the Shinagawa area. At the bottom of this slide right here is the Kurume Domain's Arima family estate. Moving up here, we have the estate of Matsudaira Nariakira from the Satsuma domain. And then going north from that, we have the E family from the E family's estate from the Yoita claim. A couple things I want to point out before I show you the modern slide. This is Tokyo Bay, and this road right here is the Tokaido, one of the 5 great highways linking Japan. And this was the Tokaido ran from Edo to Kyoto. If we look at a modern map, you can see the land has been filled in and is now Shinagawa Station, and this is a major thoroughfare, but the road is still there. The Arima estate is now the Shinagawa Prince Hotel. The Satsuma Domains estate is currently the Grand Prince New Takanawa International, and the E domain, or the E family's estate, is the Grand Prince Hotel Takanawa. So again, we have hotels in this area here. This hotel was closed in 2010, reopened in 2011, and then closed for good in 2020. It was the KQX Hotel. Looking at the map here, you can see the area is all given over to daimyo estates, temples, and commoner districts. We're going to return now and get a little bit closer to the castle. And we have the Abe family's estate here from the Shirakawa domain. And then going up right outside the Hibiya Gate, we have the estate of the Honda family from the Okazaki domain. Notice the waterways again, this moat right here. It has become a highway as well as a rail line here. And the Abe family estate is now the Imperial Hotel. And the Honda family estate is the Peninsula Hotel. The last hotel that I'd like to show you is right outside the doors of the castle, Otemon. This area right here was the family estate of the Matsudairas of the Tokugawa. Well, they're related to the Tokugawas, but the Matsudaira family from the Fukui domain. However, in the Meiji fire of 1657, it was burnt down and it was never reconstructed. And in its place, they built the shogunate had its tatami mat storehouse located right here. And this area is now the Palace Hotel. Now, there are about 150 daimyo in the city at any given time, and the daimyo had to have an audience with the shogunate once a month. But given the large number of daimyo in the city, there was no way they could all have the audience on the same day. So audiences were broken down into 3 days. Those audience days was on the 1st, the 15th, and the 28th of every month. The daimyo and shogunate officials would have to come up to the castle, and they would be escorted by the retainers, and they would go into the castle for their audience. They would have to leave the retainers outside the castle gates, and the 50 to 100 retainers for each daimyo would wait in this area. There was a special structure built for them. It was called a koshikake, and we can see that right here. It was 110 meters long. It was 10 meters wide. It was roofed and had tamped earthen floors so people could get out of the weather. So if we look at maps, when you look at maps, generally speaking, any green spaces, parks, universities, hotels, hospitals, government officials, and the like were probably daimyo estates. Highways and expressways were where waterways were or where waterways are. Tokyo's history is revealed much more in its place names and its layout than in its architecture. Tokyo's Otemon. It's the entrance to the eastern gardens of the Imperial Palace. However, Edo's Otemon was the castle's front door. And here we see a view on an audience day. We can see the koshikake laid out right here, and we can see the retainers waiting as their lords go in to the castle. On either side of the bridge, there was a sign that said Geba, which means dismount. And these signs, which are shown right here, which are closer than they should be, they're 54 meters from the bridge, were placed here, and everybody, except for a very select few daimyo, would have to dismount from the horses or palanquins before heading into the castle. Now, when the daimyo's retainers were waiting here, what would they do? They were there from 10 o'clock to 2 o'clock all day, rain or shine, summer or winter. So they would spend their time gambling, drinking, and eating, and trading gossip. Officially, they weren't supposed to do that, but they did. And here we have a nice ukiyo-e giving us a feel of what that was like. There's a saying in English that you may be aware of, scuttlebutt. And the scuttlebutt comes from a naval term. A butt was a barrel filled with water. And sailors would gather there, and when they're drinking the water from the butt, they would gossip about things going on ship. In Japanese, there's a similar saying called geba hyo, the dismounting place's reputation. That's a direct translation. Doesn't work very well, but it's the same thing as scuttlebutt. The samurai from the various domains would gather and talk. Who's coming up in power? Who's losing power? What's going on behind the scenes? And it would all happen at this place right here. Since we've transferred into ukiyo-e, we're going to go into that more now. The power of ukiyo-e, the way to show us Tokyo's vanished past. And we'll start our talk right here on Nihonbashi. Nihonbashi was the center of Edo's commercial power. This was in the area where the fish market was located. And let me show you the fish market. The fish market was located here. Major wholesalers and retailers had their stores here. This was one of Edo's 3 hisen-ryo, 1,000 ryo a day areas. A ryo is a coin, is a unit of money worth about $1,500. So even in the early 1620s, they were doing over $1 million of business here. And before you ask, I'll give you the other 2 areas so you know. The other 2 areas were the Kabuki district and then Yoshiwara, the licensed courtesan district. So it was said they would do 1,000 ryo a day in the morning in the fish market, 1,000 ryo a day in the afternoon in the Kabuki district, and 1,000 ryo a day in the evening in the licensed prostitution districts of Yoshiwara. Of the several hundred images of Nihonbashi that can be found in ukiyo-e, this is probably the most famous and the most well-known. This is from the 53 stations of the Tokaido, both by Hiroshige, and this is the first print in the 53 stations. And this is Nihonbashi, and this is a daimyo procession leaving the city for the Tokaido in the morning. And we see various peddlers here in front of the kosatsuba. Kosatsuba were located throughout Edo. There were 9 of them. And this is where the Tokugawa, the shogunate, issued its official proclamations and ordinances for the population. There were 9 of them in the city, as I mentioned, but also in each post town, at the entrance of the post town, there were kosatsuba. So everybody would know what was going on and what laws had changed. Now we've walked and we've changed our perspective, circling around to the right a bit, so we can see the kosatsuba a little bit better here. And we see vendors going about their day. And another daimyo procession heading into the city. And here we have people saying, "Shitani, shitani, get down, get down." People had to show their deference to the samurai coming into the city. However, the ukiyo-e are not always about the famous, the daimyo, or the samurai. They also reflect everyday life. And the image that we have here is from the town firefighter brigades. Here we see the machi hikeshi, the firefighting brigades, doing their dezome shiki, which is the New Year's fire review, in which they will perform on the ladder. And the company that we see reflected here is the E company from the 1st Brigade. The standard that we see reflected on the right side here is actually a visual play on words. I'm going to get a little bit convoluted here, but trust me, it's worth it. The top part of this is a poppy bulb. This is a keshi. The bottom part is a box or a cube, masu. So if you put the 2 together, it says keshi masu, which is the polite form of the Japanese verb to extinguish. So what they're saying in here is, we extinguish. And being firefighters, it's quite appropriate. And finally, we have a glimpse of a minor urban drama. Here, a dog is making off with a fish peddler's wear, to the amusement of one of his compatriots and to the dismay of a lady of the town, perhaps the person who bought the fish. By looking at ukiyo-e like this, we can get a feel for what type of city Tokyo was and how the people lived in it and what the energy of the city was like. This is a glimpse of Nihonbashi in the Edo period. And now I'll show you a photo of what the current day Nihonbashi looks like. Next, I want to take us to a lesser known part of Tokyo. This is one of my favorite areas of the city. Aside from the more famous areas of the city, ukiyo-e also depicted other areas that had interesting venues or were well known to the people of the city. And this will allow us to see, these images will allow us to see an area that is not as well visited, maybe not as well known as, say, Asakusa, Nihonbashi, or the palace, but is still interesting in its own right. As I mentioned, this is one of my favorite areas of the city. And in fact, this is probably the major trigger that got me started on the path that I'm on now. What that trigger was learning that the Kanda River was not a river at all. It's not a river. It is a man-made canal. It is the parting end of the Kanda waterway and the completing part of the outer moat. And once I learned that, wow, there's a lot more going on to this city than I know. And as I dug more and more and more, it became more and more interesting. And I wanted to share that with people, because if you know more about the city, it becomes much more interesting and you can get more out of your time here. So since I'm talking about the Kanda River, we'll talk about that a little bit more. The Kanda River was dug as part of the third wave of construction on the third part of the construction wave for the castles and moats, and it was begun in 1620. The river itself was widened between 1657 and 1660, and it is at this time that boats can go all the way from Asakusa Mon all the way up to Iidabashi, where a landing was established, and goods that were brought in there were distributed to that part of the city. The first thing I'd like to look at is the Yanagihara embankment, which is we're looking at right here. Yanagi means willow tree, And we can see this right here. The willows were placed on top of this embankment. The embankment was 1.1 kilometers long. It was 7 meters tall, and it was built as a result of the Meiji fire of 1657. As I mentioned earlier, 100,000 people died in this. About a quarter of the city's population died, and large swaths of the city were burnt down. As a result of this, the shogunate implemented many, many new rules and construction limitations in order to prevent fire. And this was one of them. This embankment was built to prevent the spread of fire going south of the embankment and towards the castle. It also functioned to divert any floodwaters coming to the south and inundating the commercial districts or the castle. However, the sad part of the news is anybody located on the north part of the embankment was still subject to fires and flooding. So it ran east from Shoheibashi here all the way down to Asakusa. And our first scene takes place right here. And this is from Shinsanbashi. This image is said to be in August, and it is the start of the typhoon season, and the people trying to cross the bridge are being very much affected by the wind. In the background of this image, you can see Izumibashi. So we'll walk a little bit further down the river. And we come to Izumibashi right here. In the background, you can see Tsujikai, Mon, and bridge. And in front of this, we have Yanagi-mori Shrine. The shrine still stands on this location to this day. It was originally built in 1457, and it was on the north side of the river. Naturally, at that time, the river was not there. However, when they did the widening construction in 1657 to 1660, they relocated the shrine to the south bank of the river. And this functioned as the Kimon, the demon gate, to protect the city before Asakusa and the area there, Sensoji became that, served that function. The Tsujikaimon, this bridge right here, a little bit up of that of Shoheibashi, is the area where the Nakasendo left the city. And we'll talk about that in a second. Here, I took a photo. This is modern day Yanagi-mori Shrine. And I'm standing right on Izumi Bridge right here, looking downstream to the shrine itself. Moving upstream a bit, we come to Shoheibashi, and this is the end of the Yanagi-Yahara embankment. However, I suspect it is officially ended here. I think it would probably go a little bit further upstream because you can see right here, the embankment is still quite high. And when we cross this bridge, we're heading out of the city towards Itabashi and onto the Nakasendo. And the Nakasendo Way, when they come from Kyoto, the Nakasendo Way walking tour, when it comes from Kyoto into Tokyo on the last day of the tour, they enter the city and they come into Kanda Station, which is only a stone's throw from this area right here. Looking across the river, we can see the walls of Yushima Seido, which is the Neo-Confucian college, which was where the samurai youth of the day were taught. The Seido is still there, and in fact, this entire area is covered with educational institutions. This is a result of this of the Yushima Seido being here. And we're going to jump again to a modern day view. This is Shoheibashi looking upstream, and in fact, if we look in the background, we can see the trees of Yushima Seido. Here we are looking across and going upstream here. And I'd like to talk a little bit more about Kanda River and place names again. From this point moving westward, as you can see, we're moving along a rather deep, it's about 18 meters deep ravine. This is, of course, man-made, and it was done between 1621 and 1624 as part of the construction, not only to divert the Hidakawa and prevent flooding from areas down in the castle, but also to cut through a finger of land coming in from the north that could possibly allow an invading force easy access to the northern parts of the castle. When they were digging through this ridge of land here, the Hidetada, the second shogun, was coming back from a falconing trip, and he stopped at a temple and was offered water for his refreshment. He was so impressed with the cleanliness and the purity of this water that thereafter the temple provided water every day for the shogunate's tea, and hence this area became known as Ocha no Mizu, honorable tea water. We're going to go a little bit more upstream here. And in the map we see at the top, this is the aqueduct right here that crossed the bridge. And we'll get our first view of it right here. A modern day view. And you can see how deep this ravine is. It is really quite impressive. It's under construction now, but if you're in Tokyo and you take the Chuo line and go along this, you will follow the outer moat. You can really get in a very good sense of scale and see how deep this one. And remember, it was built, this was dug in only 3 years. And here is the aqueduct itself. Now, going upstream from this, there was a dam built. And north of the dam, nobody was allowed to bathe or fish in the water because this was the source of drinking water for the populace. Downstream of the dam, people could enter the water, bathe, play, fish, and they did, but the water was rerouted through the Mito estate and went through the aqueduct before going into the water pipes that gave water to the city. The aqueduct itself was 33 meters long. It was 180 centimeters, about 6 feet wide, and it was about half a foot deep, and it was covered with copper cladding. And as we can see from the image here, people did indeed take advantage of the fact that they could fish and play in the river. And here's a view again looking out towards the west. And this view is from about 1900. The aqueduct was torn down and eliminated in 1901. And we're going to change our view and look back downstream to from where we're coming. And we can see in the foreground here, we can see Suidobashi with the aqueduct in the background. And we have a modern day view of Suidobashi. And the dashed line here is where the aqueduct would have crossed the river. So by looking at ukiyo-e and old photographs at the original locations, we can really see Tokyo's past and its history. And this gives us an opportunity to recreate Edo, see the effects that Edo had and continue to have on the city, and allow us to put Tokyo into context and make it a much more enjoyable and understandable city. It is no longer a featureless metropolis, but it is a city rich with character and symbols and allowing you to get access to its possibilities much more easily. And thank you so much for giving me your time and letting me talk your ear off about Tokyo's hidden history.
Thank you, Paul. That was fascinating. And I've recently moved out of Tokyo, and hearing your talk, I feel like, oh, maybe I should move back. I certainly will make most of it when I'm there by exploring the metropolis, and visiting some of the spots. Paul and I, well, I've had the pleasure to go on several walks with Paul in Tokyo, and I've always found these tours incredibly interesting, because it's amazing what the eye doesn't see if you're not looking for the right spots. We've had some questions,
Sure.
and I am going to start with the first ones. We'll answer them in order. If we can't answer some of them, please excuse us, but we will do so later on by email. So you mentioned the Tokugawa or Tokugawa Ieyasu. So who were they?
The Tokugawas were one of the originally part of 5 men who were the regents who were supposed to look after Toyotomi's son and until he came of age. However, they squabbled. He was the strongest and most influential, and he became the shogun. He was the barbarian subduing generalissimo, and he was given this title in 1603 by the emperor, and basically he became the de facto ruler of Japan. originally the shogunate was only, and in fact, the Tokugawa shogunate was the third shogunate. It's a military governor. He was only supposed to be in charge of military and police affairs. And the civil administration of Japan was supposed to be left to the emperor. However, Tokugawa Ieyasu was able to work things. So by the time of his son and his grandson, they were the de facto rulers. They were deciding everything. They were in charge of civil affairs, all administration, military and police affairs. The emperor was only in charge of spiritual matters. So the Tokugawas were the rulers of Japan for 268 years. There were 15 shogun. Ieyasu was the first, Yoshinobu was the last. And it was not originally a hereditary thing. There was no guarantee that the shogunate would stay in Tokugawa's hands. So Tokugawa Ieyasu did everything he could to give this image. He was only shogun for 2 years, from 1603 to 1605, and then he gave the title to his son Hidetada. But however, he continued to rule behind the throne for the next 12 years. He wanted to give the impression that it was hereditary and it was always going to be in Tokugawa hands. And he was able to successfully do that. And it went from his son to his grandson to his great-grandson, and then after that, it spread out from there.
Thank you. And you mentioned at in the earlier part of your talk that Kamakura and Odawara were candidate cities, let's say, to become the center of what would be the Tokugawa's empire. Why Kamakura and Odawara?
Odawara is in Shizuoka, and it is also sort of a gateway to the northeast, to Chiba. And the castle there was quite famous as being very, very easily defensible. It was a very good castle. And in fact, Toyotomi recommended to Tokugawa Ieyasu he should take this. But there were limitations, as I mentioned. It was farther from water, so it was going to be a little bit harder to supply. And for Tokugawa's own means, it was closer to Kyoto, which means that prying eyes from Kyoto would have more access to his plans. That's why he didn't choose Odawara. Kamakura was the seat of the Kamakura shogunate, the Ashikagas. It had been the seat of the Bakufu, which is a shogunate, for 150 years. It was central. It had mountains at its back, so it was good for defense. It was on the water, and there were a lot of established functions there. However, for any potential growth, it would be very, very constrained by mountains and access overland. That was why he considered Kamakura, because the shogunate had the seat of its power there previously. However, that was limited by its physical restrictions geographically. Edo did not have good drinking water, it did not have good land, but it did have a good castle, it did have the potential for growth, and it controlled the rivers going inland, so it can control distribution, and strategically, that was quite important.
Understood, yes. And of course, the significance of Kyoto is that the emperor was there.
Yeah.
So,
before we go on, I'll sort of backtrack. And Tokugawa Ieyasu's original fief was in what is now Mie Prefecture. He had 5 domains under his name. And his liege lord didn't like the fact that Ieyasu was so close, and he was quite an ambitious man. So what he wanted to do was get Ieyasu out of his hair. So he moved Ieyasu to the Kanto region, gave him 8 domains, which made him more powerful. However, it was a much wilder area. It wasn't as developed, and it would take more of Ieyasu's effort and energy and time for him to develop that, which would allow his liege lord to concentrate on his plans to invade Korea. For Ieyasu, this worked quite as well because, okay, he's further from the spotlight, which allowed him to play the deck the way he wanted to.
Yeah, it certainly gave him more freedom and distance, definitely. Yes. And it was, it's quite ironic to think that perhaps if he hadn't been given those domains, he may have not become
as powerful. Certainly, certainly.
So who knows? Sorry, I'm curating the questions from my mobile phone, so I'm going up and down. I apologize. But now I have questions about maps. So,
yes.
how did foreign visitors create their maps? Do you know if it was, do we know anything about how maps were created?
Unfortunately, I don't. Yeah,
Mm.
I don't. I would suspect that they would go there,
Yeah.
when they were in the city and base it off of currently available materials.
Mm.
But not being cartographer, I have
Yeah.
no idea how they would
I
build the
guess
maps. And in
that.
fact, even how we make maps of current cities.
So I guess, well, during the Edo period, Japan was closed off to foreigners anyway, so there was very little knowledge about it.
But yeah, there was certainly foreigners. You did have the Dutch in Nagasaki and
Yeah.
Dejima, and they would have to come to Edo, once a year. And then you have Kempfer and other foreigners who were in the city, and they probably took notes. And as you can see from the maps I used, there was a wealth of material, Japanese maps. I would suspect that the foreigners may have had access to some of them and based their maps largely on that. After the restoration, of course, these maps would become, information was a lot less restricted.
Yeah, and then of course Tokugawa Ieyasu being and the shogunate in general, after 400 or so years of civil wars and chaos, literally in Japan, when the Edo period started, they would have been very paranoid about protecting the peace that suddenly was created through their regimes. One more question about the maps. So they seem to be accurate dimensionally. Are they? And the oblique views seems exceptional. Did the Tokugawas employ Edo surveyors?
For maps like that, I suspect they did what the Tokugawa shogunate did a cadastral survey of the entire nation. And this is how they determined the wealth of each of the domains, how much rice was produced. And this is how they could tax them. So they wanted an accurate assessment of what each domain was producing in terms of rice. I suspect during that cadastral survey, they did the Edo as well, and how they came up with that. Some of the maps, again, are a little less accurate in terms of their perspective. And I've chosen the ones that worked best for me, but as a rule, they are all pretty good, particularly of Edo itself. And the reason for this is the samurai districts did not have, all of Edo officially belonged to Tokugawa Ieyasu. The lands, all the daimyo estates in the city were given to the daimyo by the Tokugawas. They were allowed to use these lands at their suffrage. And the Tokugawas could and did take the estates away and reshuffle them. So the daimyo weren't allowed to put their names on the estate walls. So if somebody had to deliver something, or if you were a daimyo and you wanted to go visit another daimyo, you would have to use these maps. And this is another one of the interesting conventions of the maps, that if you look at the estates, you will see the family crest. And where the family crest is located shows you where the main gate is on the estate. And also the style of the gate itself. There are architectural norms set up that would allow you to assess that daimyo's income, because everything in Japan now is joge kanke, above and below. It's a vertical hierarchy. So this would allow you to know, is this person socially superior or inferior? So there are a lot of functions on that the maps allowed you to find out.
Yes, of course. And that's also one of the reasons why most of the buildings don't have 2 floors in Japan, because you can't have somebody above somebody else or below somebody else, of course.
Or if there was a second floor, they have bars over the window. So you could, light could come in, but you couldn't really look down on somebody.
On somebody else. Which makes an interesting point on it escapes me now, but when MacArthur chose his office in front of the castle, which was above. So
the Imperial Palace,
the Imperial Palace, and that was a sort of a show of power,
assertion of dominance.
Yes. So did you mentioned this is different topics. So you
Okay.
mentioned about kabuki, which is
Yes.
Japanese theater. Or, what was the kabuki scandal that you talked about in?
In 1714, there was a scandal where the kabuki have what's called kaomise, and this is before the opening season. The actors would go to the tea houses and meet with clients, with audience members, and this is a way to drum up business. And a lady in waiting of the shogun's household went to one of these tea houses for the kaomise, and actually had an assignation with a kabuki actor, and missed the curfew coming back into the castle. And this was a huge scandal. First off, missing the curfew was not something that was, acceptable. And we're going to exacerbate the problem by going from somebody at the very highest social levels, the shogunate's wives, one of his wives, ladies in waiting, to the very lowest of social status, because you have 4 classes in Japanese society at this time. You have the samurai at the top, then you have farmers, then you have craftsmen, and then you have merchants. The samurai protected the nation. The farmers fed the nation. Craftsmen provided useful goods and services for the nation. And merchants were profit-sucking vampires. And then below them, you had the kabuki actors. So you have a huge scandal. And as a result of this, the lady in waiting was exiled. Her brother was executed. The samurai actor was exiled, and the licensed theater the license was revoked, and the theater shuttered, never to exist again. And that's that scandal in a nutshell.
Thank you. That's significant of the way things were dealt with in Japan during the Edo period, I guess. We have a little bit more time,
Sure.
and maybe we can ask a couple more questions. What you mentioned when you were talking about the geba, I think. So the audience of the samurai, and where the retainers waited outside. So what was a retainer, and what were their duties?
The retainers were, are you talking about in terms of the audience itself, or the function of the retainers of the daimyo?
It's a general question, yeah.
Okay. Well, if we think about this, when people always ask, were samurai, were daimyo samurai? Was the shogun samurai? The answer to that is yes. Okay, you have the samurai class, and then with the class, you have the shogun. He was the general, he was the lead of the army. The daimyo were individual warlords who were quite autonomous within their fief, within their domain, but they had given their allegiance to the shogun. And then each of the daimyo, and in fact, the Tokugawa, had the retainers as well. The retainers were basically their army. So if we're looking at this in Western sense, you have a king, and below the king, you have the barons, and you've got the peerage and earls and viscounts and whatnot. And then you have knights below them. It was the same type of structure, with a major difference being in European monarchies, everybody gave their individual fealty to the king, and hence everybody was subject to the king. In Japan, while the daimyo gave their fealty to the shogun, the retainers of the daimyo did not give their fealty to the shogun. They gave their fealty to the daimyo. So the shogun could not order a daimyo's vassals or retainers to do anything. It would have to go through the chain. So the system was a little bit different in that aspect. So the daimyo had a little bit more autonomy. And within their domain, they were allowed to run things as they want within certain limits. However, they could not have more than one castle. They could, if they were going to do any construction on a castle, they had to get permission. So this is the difference. So basically the retainers are the support structure. They are the army. They are the foot troops, the officers who supported the daimyo and gave the daimyo and the shogun his power.
Understood. Yeah. Couple more minutes, so let's squeeze in a couple more questions.
Sure.
Some of the maps you showed, there were some sort of like little flowers, or they look like little stamps. What were they, and what do they mean?
Are you talking about on the corners of the maps?
On
Probably,
on the map, I think this question it means the kamon, the crest.
Yes, that's what probably what those were the family crests, and this is how you could tell who was where, and where the entrance was, and also you may have noticed it was maybe hard to see, but on the map that I showed of the 1630s, where they had the ridge line, they would also show spears and the spear covers, and this is another way of identifying who the feudal lord was.
Understood. So that they were basically what were outside the gate, the main gate.
Yeah, well, no, on the main gate, there would be nothing reflected on the main gate. But this is how you could say, somebody looking at the map, let's say I wanted to go to the Riccio, I wanted to go to the Riccio family estate. I would have to look at the map, find your family crest.
Yeah.
And then there it is, and that's where it is. And I would walk around to where that side, where it's located on the wall, on the map, and that's where I would find the entrance. Yeah, it wouldn't be reflected on the wall itself. And in fact, booklets were sold with all of the family crests and the images of spears and the spear covers, because this was quite a spectacle for commoners coming in to see a daimyo procession. They would see it, and who is this? And they would scan through it and look it up. And, okay, this is the Asano family from such and such domain. So they would know it that way.
What it was. Understood. All right. And one couple of maybe a personal question.
Sure.
So who, when your friends and family come to Japan, to Tokyo, I guess, where do you take them?
Where do I take them? Well, first off, I have to assess how interested they are in learning more about the city. Because I could go off the deep end and I'll talk their ear off and maybe become a little bit overbearing. But areas that I tend to go to, I like to go to Sensoji, Asakusa, because it is one of the major destinations for tourists, but it has always been. It was the largest amusement quarter in the city. And for a lot of Westerners coming in, you look at this, you've got people selling these cheap tchotchkes and novelties, and it seems so touristy. And I always like to tell people, yeah, it is touristy, but it always has been touristy. The only thing that's really changed is what they're selling. So you're seeing the Edo culture, Tokyo culture in action right now. So I always like to take them there. I always try and show them a contrast. I like to take people to Akihabara as well. And then, if we go to Ginza, and for the sheer overwhelmingness of it, going to Shibuya Crossing at night. Again, it's very much lost in translation. The scene where Scarlett Johansson is standing there and the scramble crossing where all the people are crossing the street. It's a great experience, just to see that. And then also I like to take them to some of the smaller neighborhoods where I have some of my favorite little areas and restaurants to eat and drink, to allow them to see the city as it lives, because Tokyo really it's a city of neighborhoods. And the west side has this image of, like Shinjuku, Shibuya, and Harajuku, lots and lots of people. It's modern, there's lots of activity, but where do the people live? But on the east side of the city, you can really see that. And once you get away from the major streets, Tokyo becomes very, very quiet. Everything centers on the train station that you live around. And there's always a coffee shop, there's shoe stores, there's grocery stores. It's always centered around the train station. And once you get away from it, you get it to the side streets, it becomes very, very quiet and very, very livable. And so, although it's the largest city in the world, it's a city of neighborhoods and small neighborhoods, each with its own flavor, that makes it very, very easy to live in and very, very enjoyable. This is my Tokyo. And I want to show people when they come to visit, I want to show them my Tokyo so they can get a sense of that and go, wow, Tokyo it's pretty cool city. And it's not, just one big mass.
Yeah, that's definitely true. I've also lived in Tokyo for, 16 years, and I lived in the same neighborhood. Despite moving twice, I never really wanted to change my neighborhood because it felt so cozy, and it didn't feel like the metropolis that Tokyo is, to be honest, which is incredible. But definitely one of the most appealing factors in living in the big city. So thank you so much. We do have more questions, but we have even exceeded the amount of time that we'd, which is great. So I would like to thank you again, Paul, for such a fascinating talk, and we will answer other questions by email. And I want to remind you of our next talks, which will be, I believe it will happen on July 13th. And you can find more details on Walk Japan's social media, Facebook or Instagram. Again, thank you all for participating.
Thanks so much.
Everyone, and it's also very natsukashi or nostalgic, I guess, hearing these talks, listening to these talks, because they bring back memories of the places that we visit on our tours, which I'm sure everybody, including myself, is really looking forward to visit again. So thanks again, and see you all soon on Walk Japan, Talk Japan. Thank you, Paul.
Thank you very much, everybody. Have a good night.
Thank you. Have a good day.
Okay. Yeah. Bye.
Bye.